to Kellogg's Global Politics. I'm Anita, and I'm here with my co-host Ryan.
Thanks, and glad to be here.
On this episode, we react to Donald Trump's historic victory for the U.S. presidency and what it means for the world. Will Trump be able to end the Ukrainian war on day one? How will he pursue this goal? What will be his policy in the Middle East? How will he show strength towards China? And what does this election mean for NATO and other U.S. allies? But first, is this the end of democracy as we know it in the U.S.? And obviously that's pretty hyperbolic, but it's certainly one of the claims in the election. And if that is true, what does that look like? And then I wanted to explore, when we call Trump fascist, what does that even mean?
Wow. Didn't start light, did we? Yeah, is it the end of democracy? I would say no.
Right.
No, that's hyperbolic. I don't think this is going to lead to the end of elections or some of the crazier takes from the rhetoric that we've seen in this election cycle. So I think people can be...
Well, authoritarian governments have elections too.
Assured about that. Yeah. And I think that's certainly the concern and just the nature of the victory. Because, I mean, when we were talking about this election, going into it, I mean, I personally and everybody that's not consuming MAGA media, it seemed like a toss-up. It was going to be a tight race. It was going to come down to the three core battleground states, and it was going to be close. And it was not. It was a complete and utter blowout. Polls were off anywhere between 3 to 6%, once again.
Yes.
And I think even more concerning was the shift from all demographics, all groups. 90% of counties across the United States, including, places like New York and California, shifted to the right in support of Donald Trump. So what do you take from that? It seems like Trump and the MAGA movement, and we'll get into, the underlying economic reasons for vote, but there is deep concern among Democrats currently that they have successfully built a multi-ethnic working class coalition that, if it stays at these margins, particularly with Latinos, could lead to the situation of single party dominance in future elections, particularly when you look at the Senate, because the Democrats failed to take some of the more aggressive actions that was talked about at the beginning of the Biden administration, making D.C. a state, making Puerto Rico a state. The ceiling now for Republicans is 62 seats, which would be a dominant veto-proof majority versus the new ceiling for Democrats of 52. So it represents potentially permanent institutional power. And this is, if you're worried about democracy and worried about it long term, it's, can the Republicans and will the Republicans take actions to lock in these gains permanently?
I'm not as convinced as you as this represents some fundamental shift in terms of party composition. I really think it's the economy. I think it's the border. I think people are just want change, and that's been across the world. I mean, we've just seen this phenomenon with incumbents being voted out, a shift to the right.
Not necessarily a shift to the right. I mean, because we saw the UK election, we saw the Tories thrown on their ass. So I think it's just incumbency, period.
Well, that may be true. I mean, either Britain's an exception or it's just incumbents are just losing.
Yeah, same with Poland. Poland, the right-wing party was thrown on its ass too.
So incumbents are just losing because people are unhappy with what happened with inflation and the economy. And then you have the border issue in the U.S.
I would say that is true, except for what you saw in Republican-governed states in Texas and Florida, where you would expect those states or those state governments in charge representing the incumbency, maybe being mad about something, for those to maybe stay stable or shift to the left. That was certainly what you've been seeing in Texas over the last two election cycles. But instead, what you saw, Florida went to margins unimagined. Florida used to be a swing state. Florida is rubier red than Texas now. So you saw across the board huge shifts in two of the fastest growing states in the union to the right, despite having dominant, complete control by the Republican Party.
Well, it's clear that people blame the presidency and they don't blame their local governments.
Yeah, but you did see Democrats lose seats at the state level as well. So it seems to be that's the part that, if you're a Democrat, you're concerned about, that this really does represent that there's something about messaging or the culture that you have failed to address or failed, particularly at the working class level. Because I think for the first time, people making under $50,000 a year, Trump won. And that was something that the Democrats always used to carry. And frankly, Republicans haven't changed their policy positions. Their policies benefit the rich and continue to benefit the rich. Democrats put in place, these infrastructure bills, the IRA, things that brought a lot of jobs to middle class areas, particularly in Republican struggles, but they got no credit for it whatsoever. So it's amazing that he's won like these huge majorities across so many different demographic groups, but also, this working class. The white working class was kind of always there, and that's for cultural reasons, for the culture wars. But then it's adding in particularly Latinos and Latino men onto that, which part of it is the culture war. Part of it was that Kamala is a woman, but it's the economic part is resonating. They associate Trump specifically, and maybe it's just this period of time of people looking at the pre-COVID and post-COVID era and assigning all good feelings about the pre-COVID era to Trump and to his policies, and all the bad stuff to Biden.
Yeah, I'm more on that side. Look at what happened with that. These are voters. Maybe if you have future elections and you see this solidify, but when you have so many voters who voted for Trump, then voted for Biden, then voted for Trump, it's hard to see anything but unhappiness with the current situation and the important fact that we are running a Black woman. And if you're working class, you may feel like you relate a lot more to Trump and a man than you do a Black woman from San Francisco.
Yeah, that's certainly, it's always a mystery why Trump, billionaire New Yorker, born with a silver spoon in his mouth, is the champion of the working class. But
they like the way he talks. They don't like the current situation. They felt alienated by Kamala. She wasn't able, unlike Biden, who could translate some of that, Kamala was unable to.
Yeah. And 2028 will prove whether or not this was a one-off fluke, that it was, strictly anger about inflation, overwhelming anger. And that's certainly what the exit poll said, was overwhelming anger about higher prices. But nevertheless, you have seen definitely erosions in margins across from 2016, 2020, and 2024 around Latinos, the fastest growing group within the U.S. Republicans have made gigantic gains in those. So it certainly seems, and again, these are the fastest growing states, fastest growing regions, that, it's definitely something Democrats are very, very concerned about going forward.
I get the concern, and I'm not saying it's unwarranted, but I think it's worrisome that we could learn the wrong lessons based on something that had macroeconomic, and don't forget the border too, right? And a lot of those Hispanics voted because of the border situation. We think that they're going to side with undocumented workers, but it's not uncommon for established citizen groups to not be in favor of new immigrants.
Yeah, that's part of I think the failure within the Democratic Party is treating everybody along these ethnic, racial lines and treating them as like this homogenous group. And that's definitely not, it doesn't make sense with any group, but particularly doesn't make sense for Latinos as a whole, because that is a big, diverse, because white Hispanics, very different than Native. We've traveled enough. We've been to Colombia. There's very complex dynamics there. Complex history. It's the same complexity as Europe. I don't know why people treat South America as this homogenous group of people and histories.
Yeah, there's that. And I don't know that this represents anything, but some interviews on some news programs just talk to, recent citizens who were just like, we have to control the border. It's not going to affect me because I'm a citizen. And I think a lot of them don't really think there'll be this mass deportation, but they do want less people crossing the border, maybe some of them, out of the country. I just think you can't ignore that issue. But there are these larger international macroeconomic conditions that are also present. So, I think there's both. The cultural conservatism, the machismo, again, kind of works against Kamala running for president as a woman.
Yeah, this is Biden's failure, without a doubt. It's the fact that he kept with his promise, which I guess wasn't really a promise, but was a reported assertion at the time that he would be a one-term president. Because of the tight time frame that was left, because of the lack of a primary for the Democrats, he had 100 days. And then, to your point, kind of she's a Black woman, and this is America.
Mm-hmm. So I don't think we should be as surprised as we are by the results.
No, I don't think it's a surprise. It's only in contrast to who she was running against. I think that was because I think any other Republican, nobody would have had any delusions that this was going to be a blowout, just because you're fighting macro forces that are overwhelming.
And I think the way we feel about it would be different if it was someone like Nikki Haley than rather like Donald Trump, right? I think that's important to process.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
The reaction is not just based on the other party winning, although would be disappointed and not happy about that. But the deep emotional concern and fear comes from the fact that it's Donald Trump and not someone else in the Republican Party.
Yeah, because this is not the Republican Party of the past. This isn't one where kind of fundamentally, especially when we're talking about global affairs and foreign policy, where there was a consensus. And that used to be, I remember it wasn't that long ago that it was like differences stopped at the border, that the U.S. had this vision of itself that was shared across parties of the U.S.'s role in the world. And that doesn't exist anymore. It's deeply concerning for those of us that believe in the value of the American post-World War II order in terms of it being a largely beneficial structure, not only for the United States, but for all citizens of the world. And to see that probably to be abandoned. And maybe it is all hollowed out. And this is just the natural ending of it. But what it'll lead to seems to be, return to that period before, the period of not just the Cold War of great power competition, but of just global chaos of the 1930s.
Which is terrifying because that was not a good period. And the move toward mercantilism worries me a great deal. If people question whether economic interdependence decreases the chance of military conflict, which my research suggests it does, certainly mercantilism is not a good sign. It certainly has preceded major wars in the past. I want to go back to, though, we say it's not the end of democracy, and of course it's not. But is there any sort of move to liberalism that you see maybe under Trump?
Yeah, there's definitely, that is the intent of Project 2025, of Agenda 47 and the America First Policy Institute, which is more the direct arm of the future Trump administration. And we've talked about it. They've held multiple conferences and are very close with Viktor Orban. They look at Orbanism as a model for what should be done to push back against the decadence and immoral behavior of modern Western liberal states. So a lot of the goals, and it is not saying it's unified, because they have, we talk about kind of Democrat coalition, but their coalition ideologically, it's not conservative anymore. It's a radical proposition, but it's also a hodgepodge of stuff that would be very fringe back in the past. I wanted to say freaks, but and some of these guys are freaks. It's not consistent. So there's a lot of rivalries within it. On one side, you have the conservative evangelical push, which has been increasingly dominated about, this idea that seeking political power, of there should be no separation of church and state, and that it's up to born again Christians to seize the powers that exist kind of as the citadel, the pinnacles of society. So the government, the academia, media, and pop culture. So essentially seizing all four of those and shaping them in that way. So you have kind of that element of it. And then you have the tech bro part, which is, there's been a lot of good material coming out lately, but a lot of it stems from the philosophy of this guy, Curtis Yarvin, who was kind of an online blogger bro back in the day, back in the 90s, and formed this philosophy essentially against everything that developed within Western society since the Enlightenment. So the entire basis of the United States, essentially, and of modern liberalism, of the support of free elections, of free trade, of kind of all the liberties and empowerment of the common people. And a lot of these, including J.D. Vance, are proponents that democracy is not necessarily the best form of government, that seeking this kind of neo-monarchy sort of system. And you've seen sort of headlines of it too. It's the idea that society should be ruled by the smartest, richest people, which naturally are the tech bros themselves, that they should be allowed to form individual fiefdoms, so essentially city-states, where corporations have the dominant power. So you have all these things, but everything, regardless of whether they come from a religious direction or from this, frankly, weird tech bro direction, or from the sheer raw Trumpism, which is kind of just the respect for the strong man and just kind of the dominance of his personality. All of it is going in this illiberal direction.
Yeah, I think people have to be on the watch out for any erosion of liberties. I wonder if he'll make it harder to protest things that are really important to a functioning democracy, and to what extent people will self-censor themselves, which I think is very problematic.
I mean, it's kind of a wait and see, because certainly a lot of things have been said. And certainly the things they say to themselves in terms of punishing political enemies.
Something we haven't mentioned, the politicalization of the DOJ.
Yeah, so it's how successful will they be in pursuing those objectives, and how much resistance will they see? Because we talked about it before. It's one thing you can put in toadies. You can get somebody who's willing to have no professionalism, I guess, as a lawyer, to push a criminal case against somebody when you have insufficient evidence to convict them in front of a jury, in front of a grand jury. That's one thing. But then to get convictions, I don't see that as the point, because they know they don't have the evidence. They know they can't arrest Hillary. What crime are they going to charge Hillary with, or Biden with, or Kamala? I mean, these are all people, everybody that's gone after Trump, anybody that said negative things about Trump. I mean, Mark Milley, they want to reappoint out of retirement just to court-martial him and then to try him.
Which is just beyond something you can't.
Yeah, and that's when you get into because it was Milley and then his former chief of staff, John Kelly, both famously in the last couple of weeks of the campaign, called him a fascist. And that, in terms of like when you cross the line or what sort of signs you look for fascism, definitely the political targeting of your enemies on spacious charges is a core element of fascism.
Yeah. So I think there are signs that we should be aware of, and that people have to make sure that they resist in whatever way they can. And I think one way is also highlighting what is happening.
That's the thing with, because I'm looking in front of me, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum has like early warning signs of fascism. And just in looking through the list, does Trump meet some of them? Yes. Does Trump meet all of them? No.
Right.
No, there's certainly, and the core component of fascism is controlled mass media. And that's something I think you'll never see within the US. Even in cases where you'll have the billionaire owner want to back down or cowtail to a certain extent, it doesn't affect, the reporting or the messaging, like within like the Washington Post or.
Yeah. I mean, the LA Times back down too. I mean, these are owned by large corporations that have multiple interests that are trying to protect their interests.
Well, it's not even corporations. They're owned by billionaires.
Yeah.
They're owned by oligarchs. In the case of the New York Times, that family is a benevolent oligarch that doesn't really intervene in any way on the editorial sense of the paper. In the case of Bezos, he's very rarely, I mean, this is his first intervention, but he saw the writing on the wall. Amazon AWS has significant economic interest in terms of government contracts.
About corporations. He may be a billionaire, but he represents these business interests.
He does. They have big federal contracts, and you don't want to alienate by putting I don't disagree with the assertion that nobody cares what the Washington Post editorial endorses.
Right.
It's the people that work for the Washington Post or the readers of the Washington Post that maybe care. But in terms of persuadable voters, nobody cares.
Yeah, I think it's the reason why this happened is important. Why Bezos might have these interests into to intervene in this way.
Oh, yeah, because he has other business interests that tie to the federal government. Yeah.
So it's one thing to call Trump himself a fascist, very different to think that he could bring fascism into actual happening in the country.
No, I agree. I mean, I think maybe the intent and the core in terms of his instincts, he would have those instincts, but there's still too many checks that exist.
Yeah. He can't just do away with the Constitution.
Yeah, you need an emergency for that. So,
well, let's pray that doesn't happen. So I know one of your concerns has been whether this is just the end of the post-war internationalist order.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is. I think it was already falling apart. And that was based on the things that we've talked about even over the last 3-4 years. And particularly, I mean, like the fact that when Biden, came into office, there was no talk of like around tariffs. Those tariffs on China stayed in place. There was a consensus that pushing forward, we need to be more protectionist, more focused on building up our own capacity, and basically a complete rejection of the last 70 years of policy in terms of economic and trade policy. The alliance system obviously was something that Biden did a lot to restore and to try to re-strengthen. But I think, what we'll see over the next 4 years is, and especially after this election result, because what this sent, there was this hope with our Asian allies and Europe that Trump was the fluke, that Trump was the accident. And that's not the case. Mm-hmm. This is what the American people want. The American people in the polls, they don't see the benefit of supporting a Ukraine. They don't see the benefit of why we're spending money in Israel either. I mean, it's kind of a non-ideological point. And their view of globalization is almost entirely all negative. They don't associate anything with it's kind of amazing. Buy a 85-inch flat screen TV for $400. That's like...
Why don't we have a new TV then? As far as
no, we need to get a new TV. I'm staring at the TV and better get it now before the 60% tariffs kick in. Because of course, it's all manufactured in China. That was the one benefit that Americans did receive, is that, a lot of the goods that go into our household that we use in our daily life are extraordinarily much cheaper than they would be under a different scenario. But there's a complete rejection of that because it did hollow out the middle class. This has been happening since the 1980s, 1990s. And those gains went to the very top part of our society. And because of that failure to redistribute those gains of globalization, which are real, and that's why the U.S. economy is bigger and better than ever. I mean, that's the contrast. It's like at the macro side, the U.S. is kicking as much ass as it did in the 1990s. You look at its size versus the EU compared to when we lived there in the Netherlands at the turn of the century. Yeah, it's like a third, we're 25% bigger now. So it's that growth is there, but it's not being realized by the majority of Americans. And that ultimately is what's going to hollow out the post-war consensus around all these institutions, because the American people don't see the benefit anymore of it.
Yeah, you make a pretty convincing case. It is concerning what then replaces it. You know, there's a question of whether we are just modifying that order or if it's collapsing completely.
Yeah, and I think that'll be because it's, and we'll get into it later, but yeah, the Republican Party isn't unified around this message. There is still the split between the true believing MAGA American firstists and the remnants of the capitulated establishment Republicans, which are still Reaganites, you know, at their core, and believe in a greater role for the U.S. So how much of that can be maintained? Like, I think we'll probably stay within NATO. So I think that'll be there, but will it be hollowed out from a lack of support or disillusion because we sell out Ukraine? I don't know. Will we make any progress or build on any of the joint alliances in Asia, like with Japan, Korea, and then with AUKUS, which Biden would always kind of amusingly bring up in every conversation. He's very proud of AUKUS. I don't know. But it is certainly going to become more transactional on a one-off basis. I could even see the EU being intentionally split into like a pro-MAGA and traditional Western liberal camps as a result. And the U.S. and the Trump administration helping push that along.
You know, when it comes to NATO, there's a lot of options for Trump. He could, besides withdrawing from NATO completely, he could just decrease U.S. involvement in NATO, decrease American troops being involved in NATO actions. What do you think is likely? Or do you think he will still just mostly complain about who's paying into NATO or not?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a mixed thing. And that's the thing with people that support Trump. It's always like, he's not going to do all these things. This is all just part of a negotiation position. And they'll point to, look how successful, we made these threats to Europe and they increased their defense spending finally. Like multiple presidents complain about it because they don't meet their target of 2% of GDP.
Although now, dozens of countries meet the 2%.
Yeah, and everything essentially bordering Ukraine, all the Eastern Europe meets those requirements. So this whole threat on we're not going to defend you if you aren't meeting it. Well, every country that Russia could invade first has met those requirements. So by his own logic, not that stops him from doing anything because he's not consistent in anything, then NATO would still be kind of a viable entity and partner. But yeah, no, I think the whole point is that it's chaos. Some Trump people see that as an advantage. This is the whole madman theory of diplomatic relations, that because of the chaos, because you don't know how Trump will react from one day to the next, that our enemies also won't know that. And I guess that creates some sort of advantage.
Does it though?
Well, one, it's not great for your allies. It's not good when you also equally threaten your allies with tariffs, like he's planning to do, basically putting a 20-25% tariff on European countries as well. It's just not consistent and not credible in that way.
I don't think Trump has always fully decided on what foreign policy action he wants to take. I think on the trail, he'll complain about things. I think the only real sign we have is sort of what he did in the previous term that he had. He wants allies to pay up more. He will definitely decrease the strength of the alliances, but I don't know if he fundamentally alters it.
And then it's primarily talking about where we have formal defense alliances. So NATO, South Korea, right?
Right. That's what I'm talking about. South Korea, Japan.
Yeah. I see him shaking them down and that they probably will pay. I don't know with Taiwan. I mean, it's always like trying to parse exactly. But yeah, he demands that Taiwan, one, that they up their defense to 10% of their GDP. And
crazy.
Two, I don't know if that's not a bad idea. I don't think that's impossible. Like politically, I don't think they could even do it if they wanted. That's a war level economy.
Yeah, the kind of economic pain. I mean, in the height of the Cold War, we weren't anywhere near 10%.
No, but Taiwan is much bigger, and this is an existential threat. It's not an unreasonable amount. I don't see it in a democratic government being able to get anywhere close to that. That would be we've declared a national emergency and are now requisitioning industries to focus on national defense. So it'd be taking that. That's the only way democratically that they could, or politically, Taiwan could pull off that sort of transition.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think we're in agreement that we don't see any big shifts on the alliance side.
Yeah, just probably not. Biden did have that historical summit between Japan and South Korea and getting them to work closer. I mean, there are ways that the alliances were strengthened that will probably weaken. There might be less joint exercises until these countries pay up or something. How Trump decides to participate in that will be an interesting sign.
Yep.
So one other thing that I wanted to bring up is that, The Economist had the statement that Trump has defined a new political era for the U.S. and the world and is the most consequential president since FDR. Do you agree?
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, it depends on how these 4 years go. I'd say at this point, no.
Yeah. I don't think just the election of Trump makes him the most consequential president. I mean, FDR dramatically changed the Social Security system, the net that people have enjoyed today that they may take for granted. But, maybe Trump can do something that fundamentally, but certainly I don't think he's done that yet.
No, I mean, I think the ambition potentially is that 4 years is nowhere near enough to accomplish. I mean, remember FDR was in there 4 terms. Mm-hmm. He fundamentally reshaped what role the federal government plays in people's lives. I mean, fundamentally. Conservatives hate that. They want to roll that back to the pre-New Deal era. And then fundamentally change the role of the U.S. in the world. I mean, defeated fascism and then set us up for kind of a permanent military and global superpower. Mm-hmm. So it's just a big line. It's a big line to say, I could get where you're like, okay, he's the most consequential president since Reagan. Because Reagan certainly defined a period up till Trump. I would say we were basically those 30, 40 years we were living under terms defined under the Reagan administration, fundamentally. Democrats had to adjust to that in order to gain political victories. And maybe Obama began to push back against some of that. Clinton fundamentally was...
Right, he did not.
The triangulation and was fundamentally shifting the Democrats to the right. So yeah, I could see being most consequential since Reagan and maybe surpassing Reagan, even at this stage, even just with the first term. I think you could maybe argue, but I think it would take, you'd have to judge it in retrospect. But it has the potential to do that. If they succeed in turning back the timeline, like around the federal bureaucracy and making it a spoils system like Andrew Jackson. If they go back to the mercantilist high tariffs and then just one-off bilateral negotiations in terms of alliance system or of convenience, that would do it. That would be as big a deal as FDR. Yeah.
So I think it's one of those things that's a little hyperbolic that we see constantly in the media, but after another 4 years, that might be the case. As you said, if, Schedule F goes through, dramatically transforms the federal government.
Now, mind you, all of this, In terms of like the level of competence and efficiency that would be required to accomplish this in 4 years would be the exact polar opposite of that first term administration.
Yeah.
And I don't think the competence of the staff within that administration is going up. I get that the plans have definitely been formulated and they have greater coherence around that. But in terms of actually accomplishing these things and a government of this size, I mean, I guess they'll deserve to be as consequential as FDR if they can accomplish that in 4 years.
That's true. I think they will be more competent than they were under the first 4 years. But to achieve that level of competency is probably, I mean, it'd be difficult for any administration.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we didn't talk about it, but the House elections are still being decided. They're still counting ballots in California. But it does look like the Republicans will have a pretty narrow lead. They'll expand slightly on their like 5-seat majority, so maybe 10-seat. But that doesn't leave a lot of room in these moderate districts for radical legislation getting through.
Mm-hmm. So we'll see to what extent Trump respects the limits Congress puts on him in the presidency. So going more by regional topics, starting with the Ukraine war. So I mentioned in the very beginning, Trump has said he would end the war, but no plans at all on what he means by that, what he would do to do so. What are the tea leaves on this?
As with anything with Trump, there aren't a lot of details. There's nothing that they've kind of announced or signaled. But there's been a lot of reporting since the spring in terms of what would potentially be in a proposed settlement that the U.S. would bring to Ukraine and Russia. But I think the most credible one came out, and I think people are regularly calling it the J.D. Vance plan, as was reported in the Financial Times in September. And this would involve freezing the current conflict at the current battle lines, essentially creating a demilitarized zone, and then committing for Ukraine to be outside of NATO for at least 20 years. The other things I've seen mentioned include rethinking that 2014-2015 Minsk agreement, which was, I think, negotiated following that initial invasion of Crimea and the part of the Donbass.
What were the aspects of it that he wants to revise?
Essentially, it's because Minsk made no commit that it's trying to seek the 1991 borders again. Okay. So it's Ukraine's position, what the Kiev administration wants. So it'd be renegotiating that, because essentially it's any of these plans that have been focused out there is ceding territory to the Russians. At minimum, what's been mentioned is Crimea and then the Donbass region, which is just 2 out of the 4 oblasts that Russia has officially annexed back in its fake votes in, I think, 2023. Other aspects of this I thought were interesting was that the DMZ would be stationed not by NATO or the US, but by European troops. And they would be used to manage kind of the conditions of the peace agreement. The US would still be available to provide military training and to arm Ukraine in order to deter future Russian aggression. So that seems like the most likely opening position, but there's no reason to think that Russia would agree to this, particularly in the current condition where they're making solid battlefield gains. They don't think, that the U.S. will be willing to militarily support and fund Ukraine anymore. So why not push for greater gains while that's possible? In terms of like Putin's terms for the peace negotiations, he wants Ukrainian troops to leave all of the annexed oblasts. Because remember, they've only conquered maybe up to half to 3/4 of a lot of these oblasts. So it'd be giving them a lot of additional territory and very valuable farm and energy-rich areas. And then the Ukraine must recognize formally that Russia has annexed these territories and will abandon all pursuit of NATO membership. So that's probably right there, kind of where the difference between, obviously, this doesn't take into account Ukraine's position at all.
Mm-hmm.
Even the J.D. Vance plan is outrageous to where Kiev currently is.
Right.
They're not willing to give up any territory currently. We know that's not reasonable.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, the J.D. Vance plan is essentially, it's not that different than the Russian plan. You aren't having to annex all of the oblast. So you are freezing the current lines, but you are essentially giving up territory formally. That's what the Minsk agreement would be, is saying Crimea is now part of Russia formally.
I think the DMZ, though, is different because that could be a deterrent against future Russian aggression.
I think it's just the territorial losses and then the potential, what that represents for the future economy of Ukraine. I think that these 4 oblasts make up maybe 20% of the GDP. So you're carving off a significant. You're also ignoring because part of certainly what's been floated out by Trump is that this assertion that, well, none of the citizens want to be Russians anyway. And that's not the case. Now, they have ethnically cleansed and committed horrific war crimes, separating families, sending children to Russia to live with foster families, the constant propaganda. I mean, just really hellish stuff. So you are abandoning a significant part of the Ukrainian population to permanent enslavement in the new Russian Empire.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of where things stand now. I think there's a lot of skepticism, even coming from Russia, that, Trump can settle this within one day, or will be shocked that the Russians aren't willing to give in to these sort of positions. So I think it's a real question. The other thing that has been floated out there is, okay, so Russia is going to be obstinate about this. What other forms of leverage can you use? So will they escalate to de-escalate and force Russia to the table? Will they finally give? And this is why there is hope. And with Zelensky, he's been very frustrated with the Biden administration in terms of the incrementalism of, you can't use these long-range missiles to strike within Russia. This Trump basically say, hey, do whatever the hell you want to bring them to the negotiation table. And they hit Moscow. They hit I don't know if they would like to do that. I don't know if they had that range. I don't think they had that range, but they would like to do something that really brings pain directly to the Russian people, to the Russian middle class, to force Putin to the negotiation table. And then does that lead to like an uncontrolled escalation or something unpredictable? It seems possible, but I just don't see, or a lot of people don't see, Russia willing to negotiate based on even the terms that the J.D. Vance plan puts forth.
Yeah, I think that's important because I think Trump sees like, oh, he has leverage over Ukraine by saying he would withhold support, and Ukraine kind of is forced to the table, but he doesn't have any leverage on Russia. I was reading that article, and we'll talk a little bit more about one of Trump's candidates for Secretary of State, and he was like, we'll escalate by putting even harsher sanctions on Russia, but it's like, that's not, the oligarchs can't put pressure on Putin. And I think it's lost of like how much control Putin has over the country. I mean, Russian experts are like, this is, since the Soviet Union, no one has had this much control over the population. And there just isn't room for protests to change Putin's minds or the oligarchs or any internal domestic constituency to really force Putin to change directions.
I don't know exactly, how successful like a escalate to de-escalate would go. But yeah, I did find it kind of laughable, the idea of, you've been doing these weak sanctions that have no effect. And, these other tools are kind of sitting here on the table to use that'll really help bring. That is kind of the agreement on both sides, is that economic sanctions are an effective weapon and will help regime change when they've done nothing. And just help strengthen kind of the anti-U.S. alliance in terms of getting around these things financially.
There's no history of sanctions ever accomplishing regime change. It just has never happened. It doesn't happen that they accomplish major foreign policy goals. So this idea that suddenly we can have even stricter sanctions, stricter financial, there's no foundation for it that it could change regimes or put pressure on Putin to negotiate.
Yeah. The only thing they would do, which they wouldn't be willing to do, because it just screws over. I mean, I'd be happy with it as somebody who works in the oil and gas industry. But yeah, to forcibly cut off Russian sales of oil. That's the thing that would cripple the Russian economy.
But how would you do that?
You're pissing off India and China, but yeah, you'd forcibly intercept and keep that supply of oil from reaching port.
I mean, that's the direct military involvement.
Yeah, it's like an embargo, a forcible embargo on oil sales.
Yeah.
You would punish India and China formally for acceptance of oil shipments from Russia.
Yeah. A scenario that's not going to
happen. No, it would tank the global economy too. So Trump's definitely not doing that.
Yeah. Yeah, I wonder about this military escalation. I mean, I think in some ways Trump would not want to see that.
Yeah, that's kind of the interesting thing, because throughout Trump's in the completely flipping, because I heard listening to some of the Pod Save America guys saying how like parts of the current MAGA movement is more similar to the Democrats of like 2006 in terms of the anti-war component, this anti-American imperialism, anti-war, which is just insane, as somebody who's seen the Republican Party and then to see this shift. But Trump is that. I think he is. And I think part of it is growing up, coming of age, in the 60s, then being in the 80s, but this very visceral fear around nuclear war, which isn't a bad thing. But yeah, that was constant rhetoric about World War III. We want to prevent World War III. So yeah, I think that's a good point, that he is kind of afraid of that, of leading to a situation of escalating war kind of on his watch. But also the idea of, in contrast to that, I think he doesn't want to have a big failure. He doesn't want to see Ukraine conquered immediately, at least, during the 4-year term, because that would make Afghanistan look like, a walk in the park in terms of the loss of credibility of the United States. So he has to find that line between, I think, this real aversion of something leading to greater war, of the threat of potential nuclear exchange, and a humiliating loss to the United States that would be he would directly own.
Yeah, so it's difficult to say. I mean, I think Trump talks very aggressively, but in his actions shows a real reluctance to escalate and certainly involve the U.S. in any possible military actions. So I'm not saying that escalating would involve the U.S., but I'm saying that that's maybe indicative of his whole policy of talking very aggressively.
Yeah, and that's what kind of in contrast. You mentioned the interview with Robert O'Brien, his potential future Secretary of State, with this idea of the peace through strength, which is a Reagan concept. But I think, unlike Reagan, I don't know if I would take his credibility of actually care. I think it comes across as a paper tiger. That if you're really that averse and transactional around these things, what chance that you're actually going to back it up? I mean, in the example they gave was like, because Trump was constantly bragging, it's like, oh, Putin would never invade. And O'Brien brought details to it, saying, oh, we would have definitely threatened to send in Marines, and the U.S. would be fully engaged and would defeat Russia within days.
Yeah, that's not.
He wouldn't have ordered that.
There's no
way in hell he would have done that.
Yeah.
And Russia wouldn't have believed it.
Yeah.
Why should Russia believe it?
Yeah.
I mean, the only aggressive action they took was the execution of Soleimani. I wouldn't trust his word for anything. So I don't believe this peace through strength. I mean, I think it would only be if you, for instance, arm Taiwan to the teeth. And maybe China's and the Taiwan issue is more credible, but I wouldn't believe any of the threats around Europe. Or if you're a nuclear power, I definitely wouldn't believe any of the threats.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I don't know. I'm a little skeptical that they would be able to escalate militarily. And it is just, how does Trump avoid this sort of failure? I mean, I think everybody's been trying to avoid that sort of failure without really a plan for success.
I don't know. We'll maybe talk about it in a future episode, wrapping up the Biden administration and kind of their foreign policy. But I mean, I think the ultimate mistake came a year and a half ago, where Ukraine had this chance, had this window opportunity, and the West overall was just too cautious in terms of operational limits that put on the Ukrainian military, and then the armaments that it provided. It just was not quick enough.
I think in retrospect, those things are true. But I think at the time, there was this really scary possibility of
Yeah, I know. It always
escalate?
goes back to the nuclear war, wanting to avoid that. Completely understandable. But I don't think those threats are real. And it was about getting into negotiation position to be able to threaten Crimea and then force Russia to negotiation, where instead of giving up 4 oblasts, you're having a tentative agreement around Crimea, not giving it up, but Russia has temporary occupation of it, and you maintain the majority of your territorial integrity.
I was saying things look different when we were in that situation where we both were pretty cautious about it, as opposed to what it looks like in
retrospect. I know, but
retrospect.
Alexander Vindman, to his credit,
Yeah,
always advocated for that, and he was right.
We disagreed with him. I mean, I'm just saying there were reasons why we had the position and the world had the position it did. And things always look different in retrospect.
Yeah.
So I think that pretty much covers Ukraine. We've talked about NATO. What about Israel in the Middle East? And here's where I think, I mean, it's so hard. These situations are so difficult because you see like so many different sides of Trump. On one hand, maybe encouraging Netanyahu to go after Iranian nuclear sites. But on the other hand, wanting to, again, there's an element of Trump that talks tough, but doesn't want to see it through. And there need to be American support for any sort of action like that. At the same time, really wanting to prevent Iran from having a nuclear weapon.
Yes, I think this is a cleaner situation for Trump than Ukraine, in the sense that Israel's already done the heavy lifting. I mean, essentially, it's destroyed, for all practical purposes, Iranian proxies, Hezbollah and Hamas. It now has, with the new Trump administration, free range to reoccupy Gaza, ban the West Bank, basically the Palestinian cause is destroyed now, in my opinion, that there is no Palestinian state, that they will remain a second-class citizen with no territory.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what will remain and what we'll see, but my belief, and just in terms of what I've read, is that the Gulf states care more about economic growth, that they have enough control over their part of the populace that maybe cares about the future of the Palestinians, that they can strike a deal even without the promise of a permanent state for the Palestinian people, and will normalize relations with Israel. And that'll create an effective anti-Iranian bloc led by Israel within the region. And that Iran is now in a position of weakness. Now they are going to restore the sanctions. We know they're ineffective for regime change, but will damage the Iranian economy. So I think between its loss of proxies, they'll still be able to harass shipment with the Houthis and things like that. So how will Trump and Israel kind of deal with that? Because that's a lot less, we're a lot less centralized than Hezbollah was, for instance. And, Iran's going to be put in a position where the only way to guarantee regime survival is have a nuclear weapon. And that creates a crisis.
So that's one area that I do fear that still could have potential conflict, a strong block against Iran could motivate it even stronger to produce a nuclear weapon. But at the same time, there is this, we want to avoid conflict and maybe pressing forward with that. I don't know. It depends on how likely they see conflict, I think, to actually attack the regime.
I mean, I've even seen like floating out a new nuclear deal. The Trump administration may be open to that as a way, which would be kind of ironic because they pulled out of the initial one. In order to, again, to avoid getting engaged. Because, I mean, they must know. I don't see the scenario where you're able, just through air power, to decapitate the regime or destabilize it. But then what replaces it? You'll have no control over it because you're not willing to commit troops to it.
We can't do regime change.
Yeah, they can't do that. But that's the split that exists. And I think that's where you'll see in who he appoints, particularly around the issue of Iran, but to a lesser extent, Ukraine, kind of what direction that may be signaling. Now, ultimately, it's Trump's call, and Trump is anti-war. I think if he is told by Netanyahu that they can successfully destroy the nuclear sites and degrade it so that Iran can't build a nuclear weapon for X number of years, that he'll go along with that, with U.S. involvement.
Yeah.
So I think that is the most likely. But then existential threat, does Iran go for it?
Yeah.
And then wage full war against U.S. and Israel.
I mean, it is a war they know they would lose.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
So they would really have to feel like their own power is being threatened.
You've lost your proxies. You've lost your nuclear weapon. You're under heavy sanctions. I mean, yeah, you can last a long time. I mean, that's the thing with Venezuela and these sort of regimes is you can last a long time. So yeah, maybe you don't. Maybe it becomes more of a failed state over time. I don't know.
I don't know either. I think it's just a dangerous flashpoint, though.
Yeah. I think it's definitely the most likely.
And I would say you said Palestinians as second-class citizens. I would say
they're already second-class citizens. But
I mean, it's much worse than that. If you're being occupied, that's not just a second-class citizenship. That's
I think it's more ethnic cleansing. I think you ultimately force them out, and they become a new refugee population.
Yeah.
That no Arab state wants to have anything to do with. Europe, definitely after Syria, wants nothing to do with. Maybe you shuffle them all off into like southern Gaza, because I know Israel's going to want to occupy northern Gaza. So I'm just saying,
if you're occupied, then that's like not just second class.
It becomes, Gaza was already kind of an open air prison camp. I think you're just taking the people from the West Bank and sticking them into southern Gaza.
So you just put them all in one place?
Yep. And you have a much higher level of surveillance and prison-like environment.
What's the practicality of moving them all from the West Bank?
Because you want that territory.
I know, but I mean, how do you even go about doing that?
You forcibly bring troops in to move them out. I mean, how do they do it? How have they been doing it currently? Because this has been going on for 20, 30 years. The piecemeal, more Israeli settlements approved within the West Bank. So they're forcing Palestinians out currently into smaller and smaller little bubbles of area within the West Bank.
But it's still different to say, oh, okay, we're shipping all of you to Gaza.
Yeah, maybe it takes place over 10 years. I could see a big push certainly happen. I mean, U.S. isn't going to resist anymore. They'll actively encourage it.
So I really don't understand why Palestinian supporters in the U.S. decided not to vote or vote for someone else, because the situation for the Palestinians are unquestionably worse under the terms of Trump.
Oh, it's going to be much worse. Absolutely.
So I don't understand the thinking at all.
I mean, I understand the left's thinking. They want accelerationalists and for the American empire project, the collapse on itself and economic collapse so that they can rebuild American whatever socialist utopia image that they have in mind. But again, that's a small part of the population. I don't know what Arab voters themselves, how they see this as positive for the Palestinians.
Yeah, I mean, I could see like maybe if you're sure like the Democrats are going to win, then you want to have a protest vote.
Right.
But since that was never the case, and one side is obviously going to be so much worse for Palestinians.
Yeah, I don't know. I still remain shocked that this became even a moderately big issue. I don't know why people ignored the horrific conditions of the Yemeni over multiple administrations where, I mean, and maybe this will be the case with the Gazans, over time, but you had massive starvation in Yemen.
It was
it was
horrible.
horrific. Yeah. It was the same thing. It was our proxy armed by us supporting this war.
I mean, there were eventually actions taken, like Kamala Harris in the Senate was one of the people who voted not to send some
but there wasn't this cause, popular cause on college campuses and with the left on this issue. Where it was like, we're drawing this red line of all the horrific things happening in the world. I mean, let alone Sudan. And I mean, there's plenty of horrific things that happen and have happened.
Well, I think it's more visible.
And it is, I guess, Israel's a democracy. But they view Israel as a Western imperialist project in itself. So that's always like, they don't hold the Saudis to any sort of standards at all.
Yeah. So, unfortunate situation, especially for the Palestinians. It will be interesting you could see you have Iran as a flashpoint, but you could also see a more prolonged period of peace in the Middle East.
I think that's certainly a possibility. I think if you throw the Palestinians under the bus, you can have peace and economic prosperity.
So that'd be interesting. And it's, interesting how you're trying to counter China influence in the Middle East. And so speaking of China, there's a lot of speculation on, number one, that would be easy to implement is tariffs, and how big would they be? And what does this say for Taiwan if we abandon supporting Ukraine? And in general, China's aggressive position toward Taiwan, do we make it clear that we would defend Taiwan? Or does Trump take Taiwan needs to pay more money before we defend them? So what do you think this is going to look like?
I mean, I think this is the one area where across both sides of the aisle that there's general consensus around. So you do see from Trump grumbling. You see him say, they took all our semiconductor jobs. Why is Taiwan so important? That was actually, they had to convince him why Taiwan was important during the first term. But going back, I think even with the most magnified American firstists, well, I take that back. Maybe not the most magnified, but even the majority of MAGA views China as the enemy, as where we should concentrate our military resources.
But that doesn't necessarily mean defending Taiwan.
I think that goes back to the peace through strength. The idea is that we need to do a much better job. And this is kind of the point that O'Brien made in kind of that interview, and also something that you guys at NDU talk about all the time. Rebuild the industrial base and arm Taiwan to the teeth so that China's deterred. That it's a porcupine that is too painful, too dangerous. Whether U.S. under Trump would actually go to the mat if forced to?
Yeah. I mean, I think
I don't think it's nearly as certain. With Biden, I think there's zero doubt that U.S. would go to the mat to defend Taiwan.
I definitely think that's true. And I think it just opens the room. And if I'm if I'm China, then I might see like no guaranteed defense of Taiwan. It might seem like an opening, but I'm not sure. I do worry about that. I worry if we don't send clear enough signals that we will defend Taiwan.
Yeah, and that's the problem with the negative side of the madman theory of diplomacy, is that nobody really knows what you're thinking, including your allies and your enemies, around these sort of issues where, you have this peace through strength, but you're also enormously inconsistent. And Trump is far more focused on economic things. And that's why people like him, because he's a businessman. He's a smart businessman. He's focused on the economy, on trade imbalances, blah, blah, blah. And I'm sure Taiwan has a big trade imbalance with us too. So they're probably on the bad guy list too, from an economic perspective.
Yeah, it's discouraging, certainly, that don't know that Trump will take, the same sort of strong position against Taiwan in itself. But I do think there will be more emphasis, which the military would like to see, on the type of weapons that we need to be investing in. Certainly in that article with Robert O'Brien, there was a lot of emphasis on building up the industrial base, although it didn't really say how we're going to do that. And that's a big, big question. And the type of weapons that we focus on producing. But definitely an increase in the defense budget to be able to do any of that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that's guaranteed. The DoD will get an increase in its budget going forward. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see, getting into the nuts and bolts, whether there'll be like big changes. Is Elon going to come in and be like, nope, my efficiency study has said no more of these big, stupid battle systems, aircraft carriers and things like that. And we need to focus more on autonomous drones and all these things that, maybe potential future business contracts for himself or for his other ventures that he's kind of invested in Silicon Valley. So we haven't talked a huge amount on the tariffs. Do you think Trump's going to go big immediately and put on a 60% tariff on China? I think the consensus has been because the Central Committee met, because they rolled out an initial stimulus package, and now they've rolled out another one following Trump's election. But the market saw the $1.4 trillion value as insufficient. So I know oil prices went down, for instance, because they didn't see that as sufficient to help with Chinese demand, the Chinese economy.
I mean, I think it's a real possibility. And the impact on both economies would be pretty severe. Prices on goods of previous tariffs on China went up 20%, just like the tariffs were 20%. So they followed pretty closely. There were retaliation by China on several of the things that it buys from the United States. So you would definitely see retaliation from China. You'd see prices go up on good percentage of goods go up by 60%. And you're right. We should get the TV now. I mean, it's just something that's so easy to do. Like all these other things involve a lot of logistics, and placing tariffs on a country doesn't involve that same level of tariffs, the same level of logistics, and just this fundamental commitment. I hope, though, it is not 60%.
Yeah, I couldn't see him going like the full amount immediately. So maybe it's like additional 25%. Because that means there's still a blanket tariff on all Chinese goods currently, right?
I think it's most Chinese goods. I'm not sure if it's completely all of them.
Okay. And that's like at the 20% range. Yeah.
Yeah. So I could see another 25%.
Yeah. Yeah.
Easily. I mean, I don't like trying to completely decouple from China. Again, I do think economic interdependence has some positive effects. Not that it guarantees the prevention of a war, but it does have positive effects. I think just the harm to the economy, the last economists think that the last tariffs on China, reduce the GDP by 0.5 to 1%. And then if this is done in conjunction with tariffs on other countries, then it's particularly bad. I mean, what will happen if we place these tariffs on China is goods will be more expensive, and then we just buy goods from other countries. For an example, as the trade deficit with China has narrowed some, it's been increased by the same amount with Mexico. Now, I know he wants to have these tariffs on Mexico too, and that just even more will raise prices because there won't be alternative markets to buy from.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's ultimately why there's a lot of skepticism within the business community that the tariff program will actually go through, because certainly the perspective is that, this is going to damage the economy. Trump presumably doesn't want to damage the economy, so he's not actually going to do tariffs at this level. That's kind of the consensus.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think my concern is, again, how easy it is to do. Presidential authority is the kind of unquestioned in this case, although kind of controversial. I'm not sure how the tariffs work with NAFTA, if you were trying to place those tariffs on Mexico and what the president's ability is to go against a treaty like that. But in general, I think it's pretty easy. But it is a little hard to imagine just the kind of blanket tariffs period, like he suggested 10 to 20% on all goods, or whether he applies that to just countries we have a trade deficit with. The impact on the economy would be so severe because you would be covering most of our imported goods. Hopefully somebody on his economic team has more sense than that.
Yeah, you would think so when you owe your entire victory to inflation, that you're not going to kind of reverse course. Now that, I mean, inflation is nearly at 2% now. I mean, it's the Fed and the Biden administration have done an admirable job in bringing inflation overall in control. That doesn't mean that prices go down. They have a deflationary environment, but maybe that is the goal. They want to crash the economy, so we're in a deflationary environment. Prices will go down then when their demand's destroyed.
That's true. I mean, they're just so committed ideologically to tariffs, and that's what worries me, that they don't see themselves the economic consequences of doing it. I know Trump doesn't.
I mean, that's how I see maybe it is a gradual, more cautious approach. I mean, I think that's probably going to be the same for the deportation of migrants.
Even talked about.
Yeah. Both of which, again, definitely a long-term negative effect on the U.S. economy. But yeah, in regards to China, I think the last thing I wanted to ask you was, how do you see China taking advantage? Because obviously China's made big inroads in institutions like the UN, and they had a big BRICS conference recently, probably the most the biggest one in my memory. And obviously Putin was there with kind of any fear of being a pariah.
Well, he has China and India as friends.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's true. I guess you had Brazil in there. Yeah, Brazil's pretty neutral with Lula. Yeah, that's true. But how do you see China playing that? And does it matter that China would strengthen its hands potentially in those institutions and then in the global South?
Yeah, I think of course it matters. I think definitely the more our foreign policy becomes transactional, the less we care about U.S. influence in general. That just opens a wide gulf for China to increase its influence, which is, already made those inroads.
Yeah. So the one thing I wanted to say around that, does our complete lack of morals going forward help in negotiating future deal? Can we compete more effectively with China if we're less concerned about human rights and the environment and things like that? Are we able to counter China more effectively in terms of business deals and transactions?
Only if we're willing to spend more money.
Yeah, we're probably not willing to do that. So effectively, no, is what you're saying.
Right.
Yeah.
I think you see less American resources available to these countries overall. And yeah, I just think the more, there's the danger of the more, if the U.S. could completely pull out of the Middle East, that also gives China more room. Now, China has been mostly focused on economics in the Middle East, but it's possible for it to gain influence there. Weakening and dividing our alliances gives China more power. I think all of those are major concerns.
Because ultimately what the U.S. is defending, and then kind of its core strength, if we all take it back to the economy, is the reserve currency and kind of the dominance of the dollar. Does China making inroads in these areas without a subsequent increase in transparency around its financial markets lead to...
I don't think we have that worry. I mean, I think it matters that they're increasing influence across the world because it matters in what the U.S. wants to accomplish. And that's part of the problem of withdrawing and isolationism is the U.S. can have less effect on world events. And in commanding deals that are actually beneficial for the United States. But no, nothing is going to challenge the dollar anytime in the near future.
And that's really the only, in my mind, that's the ultimate check on.
I mean, that would be disastrous.
U.S. power.
Well, that would be disastrous.
Is that. And that's the idea behind BRICS or around. I don't even know what the hell to think of. I guess they're going to be the global capital of cryptocurrency now. So I guess that's good. I don't know.
I mean, I think cryptocurrency challenges the dollar. So
yeah, that's what, and that's why Trump was against it initially until I guess he got a lot of crypto from the crypto bros. So yeah, I just don't see, and I know they talked about, the BRICS will create some sort of basket currency, but I'm like, every one of those countries is a basket case and is opaque as hell, and I wouldn't trust any of my money with any of them. I mean,
well, and you have the problem with that too, because you have India and China who are dramatically opposed to each other too. So how are they going to both get on board with some sort of?
You've seen a little bit détente between Modi and Xi. They reached an agreement over that border where they fought each other with axes or axe handles.
Yeah. I don't know, though. I just see India seeing China as such a strategic
long-term thing. Yeah. I don't think that changes.
So I just don't see it happening. So I think you're right. I think that's, some of the U.S.'s most powerful influence. But I think it still matters when you have more and more countries voting with China in the United Nations.
Well, I think that's where, I think it's maybe a legitimate question. It goes back to the post-war world order. Why should we care as the United States what the UN? We aren't going to listen. We're pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord. We don't care about international law. How does this affect the average American? How does this affect their pocketbook? Why is the UN, or if China gains influence in all this multilateral institutions, why is that important? How's that going to limit Americans in their daily life if it doesn't compromise the dollar?
That's an excellent question. I think that's why China has been so successful in increasing its influence, because it doesn't on a daily basis affect American lives, right? I think that it's more if China is able to put more military bases in more places, if they're able to, if the US and China are competing on an economic deal, if they're able to win that deal because there's more favorable attitudes towards China. So I think it can affect the US economically. I think it affects the US militarily, and just our general soft power that we wield, that's very important to accomplishing many of our goals across the globe.
Okay. Well, to make it more concrete, I was thinking of an example, because one thing I do see coming from the energy perspective is that LNG exports, which have already been surging, are going to go full steam ahead. The review the Biden administration has put around LNG is going to be thrown out, that study. So I think you'll have a full green light for all the future terminals and expansions, and then potentially even pipelines being built on the East Coast. I don't know if you'll get terminals like in Virginia or somewhere. That's a heavy lift, even with Youngkin and the office in Virginia. But yeah, do you see a case where U.S. gives up on, and this is what a lot of people around clean energy are concerned about, they give up on renewables, they give up on next gen batteries and things like that, and cede it all to China? So where effectively the U.S. has the LNG, where you have this case where you're competing directly against Chinese renewables versus LNG. And this is where maybe that soft power and influence because you're dealing with non-democratic regimes that maybe China has that better relation. You're trying to sell LNG, but you're not meeting it because China just dominates the renewable space and it's cheaper and whatnot. So maybe something like that, as a concrete example of where this begins to hurt U.S. directly economically.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the case. I definitely think that any of the type of cheap alternative energy that China's able to bring to the continent definitely is directly counters to what the U.S. can bring in terms of LNG or other ways of producing energy. I think also just kind of giving up the whole clean energy game in general in the United States is kind of problematic.
I mean, it depends on how long a MAGA regime is in place. 4 years isn't enough to really disrupt. I mean, they're going to lose.
Well, it's already struggling, right? I mean,
it depends on the sector, it depends on the area. But I think it's more the next gen stuff. We agree that like China dominates the current like solar space and batteries. But the idea behind the IRA and these future funds, which very much look under threat now, is investment in at the research level and in the early business stage development level. And that's not necessarily that it couldn't be restored under a future administration, but you would lose at least 4 years. Yeah.
I mean, I think the only solution to, the electric batteries that China is producing is somehow we have to out-innovate them. And if we lose that sort of research funding, that will be huge. Yeah.
I think the only area of energy that both are back in is nuclear. So this could be the nuclear renaissance. Everybody is like all in on which I know you were skeptical, but now you're all in too.
Yeah, I'm all in.
So the modular nuclear reactor, maybe that's where we can all agree. I think we're going to have those cool nuclear powered cars. That's what we're.
Yeah, I don't see that happening.
Like Back to the Future, Mr. Fusion.
Yeah. That's not possible.
I don't think it's little tabletop nuclear reactor.
I don't think we have to worry about that happening. I would say not in our lifetime, but I would say not in our daughter's lifetime as well. Can't even imagine that. Getting support for nuclear weapons. Yeah, but I think it's not the president will have a lot of effect on them. I think it's the economic considerations and where you build the plants are the biggest hurdles.
Oh, yeah, sure, around nuclear energy.
So I don't think just because Trump is in power,
there's
more nuclear energy.
For the research, that part of, because I think that is part of the IRA as well, that part won't be cut, but all the part for solar batteries and stuff like. Although the wild card in all of this is Elon, because some people speculate like, well, Elon has a big interest in batteries, and I mean, it'll definitely be for all. I think, unless a lot of the inputs come from China for like some of his products and Tesla. I don't know. I've seen things arguing both sides, that he would be like against the Chinese tariffs, but then for it because it would help with competition against Tesla. And then the whole renewable energy that, at least around battery, where Tesla has a pretty significant position, that he wants to keep that in place, the subsidies around that.
It makes sense to have selective tariffs, right? In that case, instead of these broad-based tariffs that Trump is doing, right?
Yeah.
Because you don't want them on the inputs that you use, but you do want them on like the finished products that competing with yours.
Huh. I remember that being done very effectively.
No, I don't think Trump has done that, or anyone has done that.
Doing targeted ones, because last time, it was just across the board.
Right. So I'm just saying that's, if you're Elon, you probably want targeted sanctions.
Yeah.
And Elon, his role in the administration is just kind of so fascinating. And kind of, I think it's impossible to predict what influence Elon might have on the administration.
Or how long those two very big personalities will get along with each other.
Yeah.
I think that's the big speculation. But I will say, as a point of concern, the first Trump administration was definitely like the clown car that couldn't drive straight, or guys that couldn't, I don't know what the saying is, but we're not the most competent group. And what Elon, just in his association with this and his big $130 million bet, is it introduces a gigantic amount of hyper-competence into at least the veneer of the second Trump administration. Mm-hmm. That did not exist before.
So for our very last topic, and kind of go through this kind of quickly because we're running long, but there is some discussion we wanted to have about administration appointees, because this is really where the tea leaves are based upon who has influence over Trump, who's in his ear, and who might be able to promote a certain worldview. So as kind of noted, there's a foreign policy split within the Republican Party between America superpower, Asia pivot, We should just be focused on Asia, not care about Ukraine or any other in the Middle East. American first, isolationists. So how likely do you think it is for these different representatives to have Trump's ear?
I would say probably Asia pivot is maybe the most likely out of those.
Well, we've been talking about an Asia pivot for years.
Yeah, but it's going to be for real this time. I mean, that was a bipartisan thing. I mean, it was just a Ukraine that we had to pivot back. We had to pivot back to Europe. But now we're probably going to pivot. That is part of the strategy of trying to push for peace in both those areas, is then to be able to dedicate resources to Asia. And it's hard to read the tea leaves, but if there was a consensus among all these different factions, I'd say that that's probably the most important one is around China's containment.
I mean, what does that mean exactly? Do we move more troops to the surrounding areas?
Yeah, I think we were physically moving more troops there. We're ramping up the industrial base specifically for weapon systems necessary to defend. I don't know. Money?
I mean, money is one thing, but there's the acquisition.
Getting rid of regulations. That'll help build factories quicker, right? Maybe creating performance incentives. I mean, that is the sort of thing legitimately, any sort of business leader like an Elon maybe could come in. And again, none of this is quick. None of this is necessarily, we've deterred China by the 2027 supposed deadline of when China is going to be ready internally to invade Taiwan. I don't see them putting us on a near war footing in order to, because that's probably what you need to really get the industrial base growing. I don't see any real push for that, even if there is a lot of big talk. But I think ultimately we're going to know by these early appointments, particularly at Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense.
Now, the Secretary of State didn't have much influence in the first Trump administration.
Yeah, that's because, as Trump would say, he picked a bunch of losers initially. So.
I just want to point out how much influence will the Secretary of State have?
And we just learned that previous Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, was unceremoniously told that he would not be part of the second administration, despite being a good dude and not running in the primary and also kissing butt over the last couple of months. So he said some critical things about Trump, and Trump remembers. And obviously Nikki Haley, who
That's not a surprise.
did, obviously in the primary, but then ended up backing him completely.
Yeah.
And look how that worked out for her. So she's on her ass too, according to Roger Stone, Trump insider and fun dude. What, did he get out of jail too? I think he had a little bit of a jail sentence, just like Steve Bannon that just got out recently. So yeah, it's going to be when we look at like the Secretary of State, I think that's where I had found the most information. I mean, you have Rick Grinnell, which this is the guy that I've heard, again, I don't know a lot about. I'm sure if he is, we'll be talking about him a lot over the next 4 years, but he probably aligns most closely with J.D. Vance and the MAGA movement. We mentioned Robert O'Brien, which was quoted pretty extensively in the New York Times interview that we talked about. And he's the one that was kind of talking about the madman theory of war and the advantage of the unpredictability of Trump and his foreign policy. And then we have Marco Rubio, which is kind of interesting because this is definitely a dude that was on the outs. It took him a while to get fully on board the MAGAfied Trump train. And he's had to actually back off a lot of because he was very much a traditional Reaganist, very, together with Lindsey Graham, like a strong supporter of U.S. traditional role. And he's had to back off of, like on Ukraine, he actually voted against, I wasn't aware of this, he voted against that funding bill.
That's crazy. I don't think he'll get it.
I don't think he'll get it. This would be like the guy who compromises everything. And, Trump knows he's not a real.
Yeah.
He's not a true believer, so he's not going to get rewarded.
Right. This is just the case with all these people who want in the Trump administration. They compromise all their ideals, and then it doesn't come to fruition.
Yep. And then I guess same with the Secretary of Defense. There's actually two pro-Ukraine names that have been mentioned. So Tom Cotton from your fine home state of Arkansas. He's on the record being very pro-Ukraine and also very pro-war for Iran. That would
Very
certainly
hawkish.
send a signal, I think, if you saw Tom Cotton in that position. And then on the opposite side, you have Mike Waltz, which I think is a representative from Florida, very anti-Ukraine and full on board the America First. I think what's interesting is a lot of these early appointees are people that essentially set up shop in Mar-a-Lago or like Florida based. So similar to, I don't know, Louis the 14th, like holding court in Versailles, you need to be close to the big guy in Mar-a-Lago to win influence. You can't be sitting somewhere else. So I think those Magites, the true believers that moved to Florida and set up shop there and bought club memberships and made daily appearances, they're gonna be the ones getting the big boy seats. That's my prediction.
I'll be surprised if he goes with a hawk.
I will be surprised too. So I think this will narrow down the different scenarios, I think, pretty early by just what signal that sends.
It's true. Well, interesting. I'll have a new boss.
Yeah, that's fun.
Scary. Not everyone, there are definitely Trump supporters where I work, but from a military perspective, people are even more concerned about what Trump will do.
Yeah.
Concerned about orders he might give, concerned about, there's one thing we talked about, what effect it might have on professional military education, getting rid of all mentions of climate, mentions of any aspect of DEI. So people are pretty stressed at work.
That's understandable. Are you able to talk about this or are you compromising yourself right now?
No, I have talked about it with people, right? Mostly usually
like every other previous podcast we were compromised.
Right. I don't think it's hard to find my opinion. Mostly people limit their opinion to like safe spaces. I obviously don't do that. I'm not.
Hopefully they'll never figure out AI on how to screen huge amounts of audio.
Yeah, there goes my job.
Well, if they get down to that level, then wow, they are definitely going to be the most consequential administration because they are on the ball. That'll be an early signal that they have their act together.
Disturbing thought. Well, I think that's been a great conversation.
Yeah.
And then that brings us to this end of the episode of Kellogg's Global Politics. You can visit our website at www.kellogg'sglobalpolitics.com and follow us on X at Global Kellogg or me at AR Kellogg.
And you can reach us by email. So Anita at kellogg'sglobalpolitics.com and myself, Ryan, at kellogg'sglobalpolitics.com. And as always, see the show notes for the articles we discussed in this episode.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.